Welcome to Barista Basics Batch Brewing. In this video, I'll cover the essential information that you'll need to know in order to produce excellent filter or drip coffee. We'll want to start with covering the equipment, so we'll talk about the essential information you'll need to know to operate some common batch brewing equipment. Next, we'll move on to the brewing process and best practices and some recipes that we would recommend for good batch brew. And then finally, we want to cover the key cleaning procedures that need to happen on a daily basis in order to make sure you have the best product possible. Let's start with the equipment. In order to make batch brew, we're going to need a grinder and a brewer. We'll look at a couple different styles of those. We're also going to need some digital scales, some containers for measuring, the right size paper filters, and I would recommend a digital timer as well. Let's start by looking at the grinder. We'll take a look at a couple different styles of batch brew grinder. Let's start with the Bun G1. This is a newer version of this grinder. You may have an older one that looks something like this, but it actually works in exactly the same way. And in fact, most batch brew grinders work in the same fashion. We have some common components. So up top here, we have what's called the hopper. This is a container that holds the whole coffee beans that we will be putting through the grinder. And it's really important that we are careful with what goes into the hopper. You don't want to put, of course, your hands in or a brush or something like that. And in fact, you can't re-grind coffee once it has been ground. So only whole coffee beans go into the hopper. Next, we have a grind adjustment dial or knob on the front of the machine here. This allows you to adjust the size of the particles that the grinder will produce when you grind coffee. So on this grinder, if we turn this knob counterclockwise, we'll get coarser particles or larger particles. If we turn it clockwise, we'll get finer particles. The finest size particles are going to look kind of like flour or powdered sugar maybe, and the coarsest size particles are going to look something like coarse sea salt. And we'll talk a little bit later about recommended particle size or grind setting for batch brewing. Next, we have the grinder's chute, which is where the grinds will come out. On some grinders, like this G1, there is a sensor mechanism behind the chute that detects whether or not there's something underneath to catch the grounds. On most grinders, there will also be some sort of cleaning mechanism. Like on this one, there's a little lever here that will help me knock loose any grounds that get stuck inside of the chute. And then we have off to the side here, the start, stop, or on-off switch. Let's take a quick look at another common batch brew grinder. This is a Mahlkönig Kenya, which works in a very similar way to the Bun G1. It has a hopper up top. It has a grind adjustment knob on the front that has discrete steps. It has an on-off switch on the side here. And of course the chute where the grounds come out. And this grinder also has a bag clip that holds a bag or some other container against the chute. And this clip also functions as a cleaning lever that allows you to clean grinds from the chute. This is a Curtis G4 brewer. This one is single-sided and it's designed to brew up to 1.5 gallon batch sizes. On this brewer, you activate it by just tapping the touch screen here. And that will give us a couple different recipe options that are programmed in. When I select one of those, it will give me 3 batch size options. In this case, we've programmed these to be in increments of 1/2 gallon. So 1/2 gallon for the small size, a full gallon for medium, and 1.5 gallons for the large size. Another component that you need to be aware of is the brew basket, which is the part that holds your paper filter and ground coffee in place during the brewing process. This Curtis brewer is designed with 2 different basket sizes suitable for different batch sizes, and these have different size filters as well, so make sure you're using the right size paper filter for the basket that you're using. And then on the underside of the brewer here, it's also important to know that every brewer is going to have some sort of device that helps distribute the water evenly over the bed of grounds. This Curtis brewer has a spray head that's threaded in place here, and it is really important that that's in place anytime you're brewing coffee in order to get an even extraction during the brewing process. Finally, pretty much any brewer is going to have a hot water dispenser on the front that's useful for making things like teas and Americanos. And you can pull water from the Curtis G4 anytime just by flipping the lever down. But I'd recommend limiting how much water you take from the brewer, especially during the brewing process, because it's pulling from the same boiler that's being used to brew your coffee. Let's look at another common batch brewer. This is a CBS series brewer made by Fedco. It's very similar to the Curtis G4. This one is also single-sided. It's designed for two different batch sizes, a half-gallon batch and a full-gallon batch. And to activate this brewer, you just select the batch size that you want and hold down the button until you hear the flow of water. It has a stop button in case we want to cancel the brewing cycle. It also has a hot water spout that we can activate by holding down a button here. But these brewers generally will have that feature deactivated during the brewing process so that you don't run out of hot water. This brewer has a slightly different spray head design. It's just a red plastic piece held in place by a magnet. Now that we're familiar with the equipment that we're going to be using, let's talk about the brewing process. Anytime we brew coffee with a batch brewer or any other brewing method, we are essentially extracting soluble compounds from roasted coffee beans using water as a solvent. So in order to get the best possible result, it's really important that we pay attention to both of those ingredients and how they're combined. So on the side of the water that we're using, it's really important that we start with clean water. So for that, we have to pay attention to our water filtration process and make sure we're changing water filters on a regular basis. That water also has to be heated up to a certain temperature. Generally speaking, for brewing coffee, we're using water that is pretty close to the boiling point, certainly above 200 degrees Fahrenheit or so. And we also have to use a predetermined amount of water that's appropriate for the batch size that we're brewing. Fortunately for us, when we're using a batch brewer like this, all of those things are essentially determined for us. So this brewer heats water to a certain temperature and distributes that water evenly over the bed of grounds over a predetermined amount of time. And so we don't really have to worry about any of those aspects during the brewing process. Now, for the other ingredient, the roasted coffee beans, it's really important that those coffee beans are relatively fresh. So we recommend using coffee beans that are between 1 and 3 weeks off of their roast date. You can check the back of the bag to make sure that you're using coffee within that range. It's also really important that we use coffee that is measured out to the right weight so that we are sure to have the correct proportion between the coffee and the water during the brewing process. For batch brewing in a brewer like this, a typical ratio between those two is about 1 to 16. So for every 1 unit by weight of coffee, we'll use 16 units water. Fortunately for us, that doesn't really require any math on our part. We can use a relatively simple rule. We recommend about 4 ounces of coffee per half gallon of water, or if you prefer to use grams, we can round that a little bit to 115 grams coffee per half gallon of water, and you can just scale that up in increments. It's also really important that that coffee is freshly ground. So you don't want to grind coffee unless you're ready to start brewing, because as soon as you grind it, a lot of surface area is exposed to the air and you lose some volatile aromatics. The way that you grind coffee, or the grind setting that you use to grind the coffee, has a huge impact on the brewing process. That's because the grind setting essentially determines how much surface area is exposed to water and also how long it takes for that water to flow through the bed of grounds. So if you grind really fine, you expose a lot of surface area and you also slow down the flow of water. Grinding really fine will produce really strong coffee, but it might be too strong. It might actually turn out really bitter as well. On the other hand, if you grind really coarsely, you will expose less surface area and you'll allow the water to flow through much more quickly. So this will generally produce less strong coffee, and it can also produce some kind of like sour and salty flavors. It might be overly bright if you grind too coarsely. So somewhere in between, we're going to get the ideal result. When we brew on a brewer like this, we're going to grind relatively coarsely, somewhere in the medium coarse range on the grinder. For the batch that I'm going to be brewing here, I'm going to brew a half-gallon batch. And on the Bungie one, I'm going to grind at 7.5. That's been giving me pretty good results for that batch size. And it's also really important that that ground coffee is distributed evenly in the brewing basket so that the water passes through the bed of grounds relatively evenly during the brewing process. Once the brewing process is finished, we still need to pay attention to freshness. The urn or the air pot will keep the coffee relatively hot, but as the coffee sits and is exposed to air, the flavors will deteriorate a little bit. So we want to make sure that we keep a strict hold time, or the amount of time that coffee sits and that we're still serving it. We recommend a hold time of 60 minutes. So if you still have any coffee left at the end of 60 minutes, you would dump that batch and brew a fresh one, and that will give you the best results. If you find that you are wasting a lot of coffee using this hold time rule, I would recommend considering brewing smaller batches more frequently, especially during slower parts of the day, so that you don't have a lot of coffee going down the drain. Now that we're familiar with our equipment and our brewing recipe, let's make some coffee. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rinse the urn that I plan on brewing into. This is the first pot of coffee I'm brewing today. It's a good idea to rinse all of the urns that you plan on using with hot water to heat them up and also to heat up the brewing equipment that we're going to use. So what I'm going to do is position this empty urn below the brew basket and then just brew a cycle of water. And while I'm letting the rinse cycle happen, I can measure out the coffee that I'm going to need. I'm brewing a small batch, so I'll measure out 115 grams. Now that the rinse cycle is done, I dumped the hot water from this urn, so next I'm going to grind my coffee. In order to do that, I'm first going to check that my grind setting is correct. I'm going to position an empty cup under the chute and start the grinder, and then throw the beans that I've measured out into the hopper and close the lid. Next, I want to put this freshly ground coffee into my brew basket. I first place the correct size filter into my basket and then distribute the grounds in the filter. Shake it to level out the grounds. Then I can insert the brew basket into the brewer, select brew, and then small to start a small batch. The countdown timer on the screen tells me that it will be 6 minutes before this batch of coffee is ready. You don't want to serve coffee while it's brewing because you'll get an inconsistent result. Once the brew cycle is done, I'm just going to give the basket a gentle shake and let it stop dripping. Then I can remove the spent grounds and dump those. And then I'm just going to be sure to write the brew time on the side of my urn to make sure that I know when this was brewed, so I don't serve coffee that's more than an hour old. Now that we've covered our equipment and our brewing process, let's talk about cleaning procedures. It's important that we follow a few basic cleaning procedures every day to make sure that we are keeping our equipment working properly and that we serve the best product possible. So the main cleaning that we're going to be doing at the end of service each day is cleaning all of the urns or air pots that we've used over the course of the day, because there will be residue that builds up inside of them, and we want to make sure that we clean those out to make sure that that residue doesn't affect the flavor of the coffee. In order to clean any container that we used for brewing, we're going to use a solvent. We typically use Kafiza, which is a powerful non-toxic solvent. And in order to use this for cleaning a batch brewer, I would recommend taking your brew basket that you've used throughout the day and measuring out a small amount of Kafiza. Like I said, Kafiza is pretty powerful, so you don't really need a whole lot. I would recommend measuring out a portion to make sure that you don't waste any. And for that, I would recommend using this tool called a Palo tool, which has a scoop on one end that you will use to scoop about a quarter teaspoon, that's 1 scoop of Kafiza, and distribute this in your brew basket. It's really important that this goes into the brew basket because this process is also designed to clean the basket. Then I'm going to put the brew basket with the Kafiza into the brewer along with any container that I want to clean. Then I'm going to run a cycle of the same size that I've been brewing into this container throughout the day. So I'm brewing a small cycle, and that hot Kafiza water will run into the urn, and I'm going to let that finish its cycle, and I'll let the Kafiza water sit for at least 5 minutes. At the end of that 5 minutes, we will dump out the Kafiza water and then use a long-handled nylon bristled brush, like this one, to scrub out the inside of the urn. We want to make sure we remove any residue that's left inside, so it's good to do a visual check on the inside of the urn to make sure there's no stains. If you do see any residue or stains on the inside, just start the process over again. Do another cycle of Kafiza, let it sit for a few minutes, and try scrubbing it out again. Once we have scrubbed out the air pot that we're cleaning, we're just going to run a rinse cycle to make sure we remove any Kafiza and anything else that's left inside of the air pot. So to do that, I'm just going to run another cycle of water using the same batch size that I used to clean the air pot in the first place. One rinse cycle should be sufficient as long as you didn't use too much Kafiza, but feel free to run another rinse cycle if you like. Just discard the rinse water and we'll be done cleaning this air pot. It's also a good idea to do a visual check on the brew basket to make sure there's no residue here, so you can remove it and scrub it with that brush if you need. These don't go through a chemical or a heat sanitizer. This process is how the brew baskets get cleaned. Next, we just need to clean the outer surfaces of the brewer and the grinder. So you can do this mainly with just a clean towel, wiping up any splatters of water or coffee on the brewer and counter. And you could use a brush on the grinder to clean up any loose grounds. You just want to be careful not to put anything in the hopper or in the chute of the grinder to make sure you don't get anything stuck or damage the grinder in the cleaning process. Next, we just need to clean the underside of the brewer where the shower head or the spray head is located. And if you're using a Curtis brewer like this, we recommend just being very careful, just cleaning around the spray head to make sure you don't damage it. If you're using a Fetco brewer like this one, you can clean the shower head just by removing this red plastic piece, using a clean paper towel to carefully clean it of any residue. You can clean the underside of the brewer as well, and then just pop it back in place, and you're all set. We've now covered brewing equipment, brewing practices and protocols, and the cleaning procedure that needs to be done on a daily basis. If you follow these guidelines, you'll have a consistently great product to serve to your customers.